October 25th, 1944. 06 hours and 43 minutes. Philippine Sea, east of Samar. On the flight deck of USS Fanshawe Bay, a deck crewman blinks salt out of his eyes and hears it first, a far-off rolling crack, then the scream high, metallic, impossibly fast of incoming shells. The first salvos walk in, tall white columns of water mixing with black smoke. The sea around the small carrier boils. A single sentence foreshadow, behind those shells, an entire empire's last throw. Cut wide. The map surges up under the camera. Luzon in the north, Mindoro to the west, Leyte Gulf to the east, a long slash called San Bernardino Strait in between. 6 American escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 3 destroyer escorts, task unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3 moving eastward at 17 knots, launching and recovering planes for ground troops ashore, bearing down from the strait. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, including the 72,000-ton Yamato with 18.1-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and over 10 destroyers. Main gun weight ratio, roughly 10-1. Tonnage, 4-1. Range advantage, miles. The men on the baby flat-tops have 5-inch guns and courage. By 0650, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague orders a hard turn to the east and make smoke. Thin blue screens bloom to starboard, chemistry turned into survival. Planes already on deck are hurled into the air with partial fuel and whatever bombs are closest to hand. There is no time for doctrine. There is only time to improvise. A small human action that implies a vast machine behind it. A chief petty officer rips a barricade flag from its pole so a wildcat can roll early. An ordnanceman shoves loose depth charges to the lip of the hangar deck. The largest battleship on Earth is closing to gun range with ships whose steel is 1/3 as thick as her barbette armor. Then, the shocking number. In the next 3 hours, those 6 escort carriers and their 9 thin-skinned escorts will face more than 1,000 shells of cruiser and battleship caliber and live long enough to break an enemy armada's nerve. What follows is the anatomy of that morning. How a handful of slow ships, a few dozen fighters and bombers, and 3 destroyers that refused to count odds, turned a certain massacre into a crisis of perception. How the Leyte Breakout that should have been became a blunted thrust, and how, in the fog of spray, smoke, and courage, one choice by one admiral reframed the fate of fleets. The geography of disaster was set 3 days earlier, October 23rd to 24th, the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's center force, slipping through the central Philippines, is hit over and over by U.S. carrier air. Musashi, sister to Yamato, absorbs bomb and torpedo after torpedo, more than a dozen effective underwater blows, before rolling over in the late afternoon. A rational actor would turn back. Kurita does not. He reverses course after the heaviest strikes pass, threads the tangle of islands, and, under the concealing shadow of night, emerges through San Bernardino Strait. Purpose: burst into Leyte Gulf at dawn, smash the transports and supply vessels feeding the American landings, and sever General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. If he succeeds, the arithmetic on Leyte shifts sharply. The men ashore pay. Dawn finds Halsey's Third Fleet far to the north, racing after a decoy carrier force. The gate to Leyte's east is open. There are patrol planes, there are scouts, there are radios, there are plans. But plans are brittle when the sea is wide. Taffy 3 Fanshawe Bay, Streetlow, White Plains, Callinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, Gambia Bay sits east of Samar launching ground support sorties. Their air groups, FM, 2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, roughly 160 aircraft among them when decks are full, some airborne, many staged for cyclic strikes. Their screens, 3 fleet destroyers, Johnston, Howell, Heerman, and 3 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond Dennis. These are anti-submarine ships designed to guard slow carriers, not duel with capital ships. Their torpedoes are their only punches that truly matter against giants. At 6:47, lookouts report many masts in the west. At 6:58, geysers walk toward the carriers. At 7 o'clock, Sprague transmits the order that will be quoted for the rest of the century. Open fire, lay smoke, stand by for torpedo attack. The instruction is not metaphor. The small ships will not wait to be sunk. Johnston heels over. Her captain, Commander Ernest E. Evans, a broad-shouldered Oklahoman with hair like wire and a voice like gravel, has already committed his ship. On the day of commissioning, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Now Harm returns the greeting. All engines ahead flank. The Fletcher, class destroyer, leaps, spray white as linen over her bow. In 10 minutes, she is alone on a beeline toward columns of water and steel. Range. Closing. Fire control. Manual is needed. The 5-inch guns begin talking in short, vicious syllables. The crew can see the towering superstructure of a heavy cruiser, Chikuma, flash bright as her 8-inch turrets belch. The air smells like wet cordite and hot metal. By 7:10, Gambier Bay is hurling planes into wind as fast as she can spin them up, every 3 minutes, then 2, then 1. Some Avenger crews launch with half fuel and no torpedoes. They go anyway, carrying only depth charges or nothing at all to strafe with, 50 caliber machine guns, because the math of flight is simple. An aircraft in the air can harass, distract, spot fall of shot, and force the enemy to blink. A parked aircraft can do none of those things. Lieutenant Harold Heckman, a Wildcat pilot, will later call the first pass at the Japanese cruisers like pecking at a rhino with a penknife. But he sees something the penknife can do, make the rhino flinch. The sea turns into a layered story: surface, smoke, and sky. On the surface, the little ships weave inside their own smoke screens, snatching patches of concealment. In the smoke, shapes flicker and disappear. In the sky, wildcats slash through flak. An Avenger, TBM-1C, thunders low over a cruiser and drops 2 100-pounders that should do nothing, should do less than nothing, except that fear is not calibrated to physics. Men on the Japanese bridge duck. Fire control pauses a breath. The next salvo comes seconds later than it should. On a surface measured in seconds, that is not nothing. By 7:24, Johnston is inside 10,000 yards of the cruiser line. Evans orders a full torpedo, spread 10 fish in 2 salvos, fanning to intersect where the enemy will be rather than where he is. He knows the price. He pays it. 8-inch shells smash into Johnston's superstructure and forward engine room. The ship staggers. Speed drops. Antennas whip and fall. Men die. Evans refuses to break off. He takes her in. A plume rises in the distance near a heavy cruiser's bow. Did it hit? The record will argue. The psychological effect does not. At 7:30, Hoel commits. Heermann commits. 3 destroyers become a curved blade, their wakes arcing into the teeth of battleships. This is the wrong fight with the wrong ships at the wrong range. It is the only fight available. The macro picture clarifies by 7:40. Sprague has turned his carriers due east, into the wind, to maintain launch recovery cycles. The baby Flattops can make 18 knots on paper, 16 or 17 on a day like this. Kurita's Vanguard can make 25. The Japanese rangefinders read and adjust with practiced calm. Shell fall tightens. On Fanshawe Bay, a near miss lifts the stern as if by the hand of a god. On Kalinin Bay, a shell punches through the thin side plating and exits without exploding, leaving a hole the size of a man. On White Plains, the ship's 5-inch mount, firing at maximum elevation, sends luck into the world. A shell lands near the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai's stern, where aircraft bombs have already done damage, and chaos compounds chaos. Air power returns as a system rather than a scene. Every pilot airborne, whether from Taffy 3 or her sister groups to the south and north, is vectoring to the smoke pillars. There is no time to arm torpedoes in orderly racks. There is no doctrine for fighting a battleship with depth bombs. There is only the logic of pressure. Avengers dive shallow and drop near misses that hammer hull plates. Wildcats strafe fire control positions and bridges. Anti-aircraft crews on Japanese decks, trained to shoot at high-speed dive bombers, flail at attacks from odd angles and low altitudes. If this is true locally, this follows system-wide. Small aeroborne irritants, multiplied hundreds of times, distort the enemy's sight picture and waste his minutes. At 8:03, a line of water spouts marches across Gambier Bay's wake and catches up. An 8-inch shell finds her, then another, Her speed bleeds. She slowly falls out of formation, the only one of the 6 carriers that cannot keep even a meager lead. The Japanese heavy cruisers have spied prey they can finish. Gambier Bay's crew fights her like a living thing, counter-flooding to correct a list, jettisoning weight, keeping the screws turning. But water is patient, steel is honest. If the enemy keeps hitting at 20,000 yards, the small ship will die. The question is not whether, it is when and what she can buy with her death. We cut to the Japanese flagship's bridge. Kurita has endured a night of confusion. Radio reports of American carriers to the north, reports of heavy damage yesterday in the Sibuyan Sea, the eerie invisibility of American UHF voices calling vectors he cannot hear. He knows he has surprise. He believes he has found a carrier task force. The baby flat-tops look for a moment like fast carriers, because carriers are carriers at a glance through smoke. He knows time is the only capital he cannot borrow. Every minute he spends shooting tiny carriers is a minute the Americans in Leyte Gulf use to run or dig deeper. Yet his vanguard's gunnery officers urge him on. Their range tables whisper certainty. The shell splashes prove it. And still those little greyhounds. Those cursed torpedo beats that turn water to glass and then to torn sky. An admiral feels the weight of risk as a physical ache. On Heerman's Bridge, Commander Amos T. Hathaway, tall, spare, calculating, leads his ship through the edge of smoke and, for an absurd half-minute, presents himself to 3 battleships at once, a single destroyer between the Yamato's main battery and his own carriers. He punches tubes, empty 10 torpedoes, angling for a crossing shot that forces giants to turn. The great battleship swings a degree or two, then more. Geometry is victory. Yamato's turn opens distance and costs minutes, the one thing that cannot be recovered. Heerman then duels with the heavy cruiser Chikuma, trading gunfire like equals. They are not equals. And yet for 5 minutes, then 10, they seem to be. 7:50 to 8:30 becomes a drum riff of anaphora measured in steel and will. The destroyers charge. The carriers run. The pilots harass. The gunners correct. The shells fall. The smoke holds. The numbers say death. The actions say not yet. On the escort carrier decks, ordnance crews break seals on old torpedoes meant for anti-submarine patrols and fit them to Avengers not designed to carry 2. Pilots scribble target names in grease pencil on canopies. Yamato, Kumano, Chokai. There is dark humor now, a means of steadying hands. One TBM crewman, glancing at the naval mine lashed in a torpedo bay because that is what they have, mutters, "If it hits, we'll know." They go anyway. The effect is cumulative. It is never one bomb, never one pass, never one torpedo. It is 200 actions that blur into one sensation on the enemy's bridge. This is not control. This is getting worse. By 8:20, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413, hears the call and turns in. She was built to stalk submarines and shepherd helpless ships. She is 306 feet long and thin as a promise. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, addresses his crew over the 1MC with 9 words that unspool like cable. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds. Then the kicker, "We will do what damage we can." He orders flank speed and overrides safety limits on the boilers. The little ship heaves to 28 knots, maybe a whisper more, her decks trembling, valves rattling like castanets. She runs at a heavy cruiser and opens with her single 5-inch mount as if she has a battery of 10. Rate of fire climbs 10, 12, 15 rounds a minute. The barrel smokes. The crew chants a rhythm that keeps muscles moving. What happened next made the pattern obvious. The torpedo attacks Johnston's first, Hoel's. Heermans do not need to sink anything to do the essential work. They break the Japanese line into knots and eddies. A heavy cruiser corrects course to evade suspected tracks and masks the battleship behind her. A battleship turns to unmask turrets and reduces relative speed. A destroyer leader accelerates to lay smoke where smoke is not doctrine. Each tactical solution consumes time. Each minute used creates space to the east where the carriers can move and launch. Gambier Bay cannot make the space. The Japanese heavy cruiser line, blood up, is now racing to finish her. At 8:40, multiple hits slow her further. At 8:55, water reaches her generators. The ship's surgeons move wounded out of the path of rising water, while gunners, stripped to the waist, keep loading 5-inch shells that barely reach the gunnery arcs of distant cruisers. Aye, aye, to the end. At 9:07, she rolls. Men jump. In the water, rafts deploy, oil smears across faces, and the sound of battle recedes like a storm moving offshore. It is the first American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the war. And still, the American line holds on the only axis that matters: time. The numbers told a different story than tonnage now. Chokai has been maimed by bomb blasts near her aft machinery, then finished by torpedoes from Japanese destroyer Fujinami after being abandoned. Chikuma staggers under repeated air attacks. Her rudder jams, her speed collapses under the burden of damage control. Suzuya, running hard to keep up, suffers near misses that trigger a catastrophic magazine fire in her torpedo warheads by early afternoon. Kumano's bow is blown nearly off by a torpedo strike. She limps away, head down, and will not return to the line. Taffy 3's destroyers have paid, their waterlines are serrated and bleeding, but the enemy's neat strike toward Leyte has become an ugly spiral, a flinch, a regrouping within earshot of gunfire. This is the micro-made macro, cause chains drawn on the sea. A single torpedo spread forces a turn. The turn masks a battleship battery. Masked batteries reduce pressure. Reduced pressure buys launching windows. Windows put more Avengers and Wildcats overhead. More aircraft mean more near misses, more strafing runs, more smoke, more time. Time accumulates into uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds caution. Caution calcifies into a withdrawal option. The clock bleeds forwards in jet fuel and courage. At 9:20, Samuel B. Roberts closes to absurd pistol shot ranges with a heavy cruiser and pours 5-inch shells into her superstructure at 8,500 yards, then 7,000, then 6,000. Men on the DEs after deck pass ammunition by hand, skin blistered by hot brass. Copeland runs the hull like a boxer working inside, dodging splashes by half seconds. The DE is hit, and hit again. She lists, but keeps her teeth in. "We're in so close," one gun captain mutters. "We can see them." It is both exhilaration and doom. At around 9:45, massive shell fire tears her open. Copeland gives the order to abandon ship at 10 o'clock. She will roll over minutes later, having fought like a ship 2 classes bigger. Survivors in the water, clinging to rafts, watch smoke pillars, and write the images on their nerves forever. On Johnston, Evans has taken a shell through the bridge that shatters his left hand. He wraps a handkerchief around it and stays on his feet. The destroyer's speed is down, her forecastle twisted, but she will not fall out. He puts Johnston between the carriers and a cruiser, absorbing a beating that would kill a different ship outright. "We are going to die," a gunner's mate thinks. And then, in the same breath, "But not before we matter." The 5-inch mount keeps barking. The barrel glows dull red. Heerman, wounded but game, now fights a cruiser on one side and checks a Japanese destroyer probing through smoke on the other. It is not balance, it is triage. Each salvo she draws is a salvo not falling on Kalinin Bay, struggling to keep pace with Streetlow. Each minute she lives, moves the carrier, wakes another mile eastward. By 10 o'clock, Sprague's carriers have more air overhead than at any time since the first salvos fell. The radio net is a storm of call signs. Wolf 2, in hot. Bear 1, torpedoes gone. Monkey 3, Winchester. Pilots running out of ammunition make dry passes to scare gunners. Pilots low on fuel push the red line and stay on station, because landing now means a long downwind leg through a killing ground. "I can give you one more," a Wildcat pilot tells his controller with a levelness that can only be called love. There is a paradox at work here, an irony through scale. The biggest guns on Earth are firing at ships so thin that many shells pass through without exploding fuses, tuned for thicker armor, do not trigger on the escort carrier's light skins. Meanwhile, the smallest weapons inflict outsized harm. A Wildcat's strafing run kills an exposed rangefinder team. A 100-pound bomb lands wrong but shakes the delicately balanced fire control. The technical and the human intersect in strange places. Systems meant for battleship on battleship duels do not translate cleanly to knife fights with gnats. By 10:30, a before and after is visible even without a map. Before, Kurita's line is long, confident, pressing. After, His line is broken into clusters, cruisers limping to the west, battleships angling off, destroyers laying smoke for themselves instead of others. Before, Taffy 3's 6 carriers in humiliated flight. After, 5 carriers still running, wounded but launching, and an air umbrella thickening. The Japanese breakout toward Leyte has not been stopped, strictly speaking. But it has not continued. It has, this is the word, stalled. And everywhere, water. Oil slicks rope the surface in ribbons. Lift rafts form ragged parades eastward. Destroyer decks are washed down with hoses that run rust-colored. Carriers' crews feed ammunition belts into mounts so hot they smoke. Men sip from canteens that taste like aluminum, like fear, like relief. At 10:50, with the surface action easing, a new sound cuts in from higher altitude, the descending whine of an aircraft in a different kind of dive, deliberate, controlled, still unfamiliar as a tactic. A Zero with a bomb cradled under its belly lines up on street low, but that is a later story in this morning's chain, the ghostly birth of something that will haunt the Pacific until victory over Japan Day. For now, for the rhythm of the development, fix on the truth already earned. The center force has been stunned. The numbers continue to accrete and then flip expectations. Roughly 150 American aircraft from Taffy 3 and neighbor task units cycle in. Dozens of sorties press attacks at low altitude. Hundreds of 5-inch shells from 7 small escorts, augmented by the carrier's own single mounts, keep the sky stitched with tracers. On the Japanese side, salvo counts remain high, but hits do not convert to kills at the rate the tables promised. The American destroyers have paid with their hulls. Johnston is sinking, Hull is mortally hurt, Samuel B. Roberts is gone. And yet the effect, the only effect that matters to Leyte, has been accomplished in embryonic form. The transports in the Gulf still load and unload, the beachhead breathes, the maritime lung of the invasion keeps inflating. Zoom out to the system again. The Leyte operation is an organism. It lives if supplies flow, and dies if they are cut. Kurita's task was surgical, sever the arteries feeding MacArthur's troops. He found instead a swarm of capillaries that refused to clot. Doctrine says a swarm is disorganized. Reality says a swarm forces you to attend to too many things at once. Too many things at once is the natural enemy of decisiveness. At 11 o'clock, a final wave of Avengers locates cripples to the west. Torpedoes that were not supposed to be aboard these carriers in these numbers run true. Chikuma, already battered, takes a mortal blow. Suzuya's internal fires cross a boundary that damage control cannot reverse. She will explode and sink later. Kumano's wound is permanent. She is out. The surviving battleships, bruised and somewhat blinded by smoke and by the rhythm of harassing strikes, now face a choice that was not on the table at dawn. Continue southeast into Leyte Gulf without a coherent cruiser screen, or turn back through San Bernardino with their heavy units intact. The micro-stories resolve into a single visible phenomenon across half an ocean, an enemy fleet that could go forward and does not. And the men who made that possible, shivering in oil-stained water, watch the silhouettes on the horizon change direction and ask themselves if their eyes lie. A last image before the reveal to come. On Fanshawe Bay's wind-torn deck, at 11:20, a handler chalks a quick, crude-line drawing of a battleship on the bulkhead and draws an arrow turning away. They're going, he tells no one in particular. A radio man, headset off one ear, nods once and answers, flat as gravity, "We bought enough." He had minutes. Not ships, not armor. Minutes. At 10:30, with the horizon a torn curtain of smoke and spray, the battle tilted on something invisible. Perception. On Yamato's bridge, plotting tables said one thing, targets to the east. Slow, fragile, already bleeding. The sky said another swarming aircraft, persistent, coordinated, behaving like the combat air patrol of a fast carrier task force. Kurita stood in that contradiction. Every fresh splash near a carrier confirmed the gun line's faith. Every new dive from a wildcat suggested a larger hand at work. A decision formed where mathematics met fear. He had ordered general attack at 9/11, a doctrine meant to unleash initiative. It did the opposite. Formation loosened. Cruisers surged, then checked. Battleships swung to unmask turrets, then lost mutual support. What looked like aggression from each bridge looked like confusion from above, and above was where the Americans lived now. The small carriers, still running, still launching, had made an air picture bigger than themselves. Taffy 3 was a unit of 6. Through the morning, Taffy 2 and Taffy 1 bled their aircraft into the same fight. A swarm is not a formation, but it is a fact. At 10:20 to 10:40, something subtle but decisive happened in the Japanese mind. The mission slid. Smash the landing ships in Leyte Gulf that had been the line. Now, with 2 heavy cruisers crippled and a third limping, with torpedo wakes remembered more vividly than shells scored, with the biggest battleship on Earth having already once thrown her helm over to evade ghost tracks, the imperative shifted to survivability. Could they still punch into Leyte without a cruiser screen? Could they arrive with ammunition to fight again? Could they find the invasion fleet before the fast carriers? Surely they were close descended in strength. Kurita chose. Before noon, his force began to sheer north and west, not south into the Gulf. Not into certainty, but away from it. He would preserve his heavy units, deny the Americans the decisive capital ship kill they craved, and live to reform beyond the strait. The breakout into Leyte, audacious, surgical, devastating if it landed, was blunted at the moment endurance turned into caution. The Japanese center force, built to hammer, recoiled. And yet, as the surface fire slackened, a new note entered the soundscape, thinner, higher, deliberate, 10:50. The sky above street, low, looked like reprieve, until a single 0 slid down in a controlled dive, not a dogfight pass, but a delivery. The bomb struck near the flight deck and punched through. Secondary explosions followed, a fast-forward chain hangar deck ordnance, aviation fuel, stored munitions, an accelerating burn the damage control teams could not throttle. At 11:25, Street Low was gone. The first carrier in history to be sunk by a deliberate suicide attack. The image will return 100 times in the next 10 months. But here, it was a coda to the morning, a reminder that the enemy could bleed and still invent new ways to draw blood. The air filled with smoke and prayer. Rafts bloomed. The sea took on a deeper sheen of oil. Sprague watched the fireball and felt the shiver of 2 truths at once. They had survived the impossible. The day had just changed its rules. What happened next made the pattern obvious. The American escort carriers continued east, herding their survivors, recovering what aircraft they could, launching what they dared. To the west, the Japanese began the slow calculus of damage and distance. Chokai was abandoned and finished by friendly torpedoes. Chikuma sank under the weight of repeated airstrikes and a final underwater blow. Suzuya's internal fires, born of near misses and torpedo warheads cooking off, crossed the point of no return and took the ship down. Kumano, her bow grotesquely truncated by a torpedo earlier, waddled out of the fight, a cripple with a memory. Yamato, Haruna, Nagato, Kongo, untouched in their vital organs, were nonetheless diminished. Ammunition was not infinite. Fuel was not infinite. Confidence was not infinite. The reveal lands like a ledger. Taffy 3 didn't win by killing battleships. It won by collapsing a timetable. The open loop closes. The wall of water in the first seconds, the white pillars stepping toward the baby flat-tops, had promised annihilation. It delivered something stranger. Hesitation. Not because steel failed, but because judgment faltered under invented pressure. Smoke was a weapon. Radio was a weapon. Courage was a weapon. Time, turned into matter, became the heaviest weapon on the sea. This is the thesis. Not mass against mass, but minutes against momentum. By afternoon, the sea was a palimpsest of crises. South of the strait, the night's earlier verdict at Surigao had already been written. Nishimura's southern force, crushed in a classical crossing of the T by American battleships guided by radar and memory. North of Samar, the decoy carriers that had lured Halsey away were being run down and destroyed, ships sacrificed to draw steel teeth off Leyte's throat. In between lay the place where a breakout had been blunted by men whose ships had no business taking that much fire and still forming sentences on the radio. Enemy retiring. A pilot reported in a tone that carried wonder and restraint in equal measure. Keep them moving, Sprague replied, a directive that was really gratitude. Heerman, a listing, scorched, shrapnel-bitten silhouette, still had torpedo tracks imprinted behind her eyes. Johnston was gone, her last moments a collage of smoke, and a captain with a bandaged hand refusing to step away from the fight. Howell lay on the bottom. Samuel B. Roberts had fought herself out to the last round. The last knot, the last steady deck then rolled. The living drifted. The dead counted themselves into memory. The numbers that remained settled the scale. 16-inch guns had fired thousands of pounds of steel at ships whose hulls could be pierced by an angry glance. Many shells went straight through without detonating, because fuses set for armored belts could not find enough resistance in thin skins to arm. 5-inch guns, intended for submarines and aircraft, had reached across impossible arcs and cut into rangefinder nests and bridge wings on cruisers that should have ignored them. Avengers, loaded with depth charges. Depth charges had pocked plating and rattled men. Wildcats had delivered strafing passes that were tactically minor but psychologically absolute. Each insult was small, the sum was decisive. Consequences grew with distance. On Leyte's beaches, cranes kept swinging. Combat cargo kept moving from ship to shore. Rations, ammunition, radios, gasoline, and 5-gallon cans passed hand to hand by men in shorts and helmets under a white Sunday artillery lifted. Infantry advanced. On charts on MacArthur's table, colored grease pencil lines kept extending inland. A timetable for the liberation of the Central Philippines held together because a timetable at sea had come apart. To Tokyo, the day's reports brought the opposite arithmetic. In the morning, optimism that an audacious thrust might shatter an invasion in mid-breath. By evening, a carrier decoy force annihilated, a southern hammer broken, a center spear turned back with cruiser losses it could not replace. The oil feed from the south, the reason for so many risks, remained severed by American submarines and aircraft. The Empire's strategic bloodstream kept thinning. The debut of organized suicide attacks, effective in shock and terrifying in method, could not replace the lost capacity of the fleet. Back on the emptying sea, rescue took the rest of the day and the next. Destroyer escorts and fleet tugs combed oil slicks and rectangles, whistling through teeth to catch a voice that might answer. Sharks came. Sailors beat them away with oars and curses. A raft flipped and flipped again under the weight of men with no strength left for dignity. Hands reached and pulled anyway. A chaplain worked his way from float to float like a fisherman, his prayers as practical as bread. Some pilots stitched to hover over their own survivors, floating guardian angels who bled from scalp wounds and refused to leave. The sun set a second time on the same eyes. In the after-action rooms, the wardrooms and small offices, where calm men with notebooks make sense of chaos, pattern recognition took hold. Deception mattered, but only because execution made it believable. Smoke mattered, but only because gunnery discipline and helmsmanship made smoke a shield rather than a hiding place. Aggression mattered, but only because the torpedo runs were coordinated well enough to become geometry and not theater. Each word in the battle's retelling improvisation, audacity. Luck hid a more prosaic truth. Habits drilled in quiet weekends. Damage control, ammunition handling, formation keeping. Radio brevity. Let men improvise at speed when routine shattered. The postscript that cannot be avoided. Names. Ernest E. Evans, who took Johnston alone into a wall of cruisers, because that was the only way to buy minutes. Robert W. Copeland, who told his thin ship the truth, and then made those 9 words into a plan. Clifton A.F. Sprague, who reacted in seconds, turned into the wind, and turned thin air into fighters. Amos T. Hathaway on Heerman, calculating angles under fire, and making giants swing wide. Their crews, anonymous as a choir, and loud as one. A dozen officers and 1,000 sailors who found out who they were in real time. The camera swings, sharply, to the Japanese side one more time, because the story is not complete without the other bridge. Kurita returned through San Bernardino Strait with heavy units intact and cruisers bleeding. He would be praised for preservation, blamed for caution, judged by officers who never stood where he stood with shells falling around men they could see. He had faced a battlefield that refused to behave like carriers, behaving like heavy ones, destroyers behaving like cruisers, aircraft arriving from everywhere, torpedo tracks that might have been imagined and could not be ignored. He made a call. History's argument with that call will go on as long as men study sea fights, but one line remains unchallenged. The landing at Leyte did not stop. After Leyte, the war rushed downhill. The Philippines became a campaign of attrition, with only one direction. The Imperial Navy, stripped of fuel and trained crews, retreated into anchorages, powerful on paper, static in fact. The kamikaze became a tactic rather than a single morning's shock, a brutal efficiency born of desperation that inflicted new scars on the American fleet but could not reverse the arc. Yamato would make one final sortie half a year later and never return. The abyss widened. Memory condensed. Decades later, the men who had been young in 1944 would sit under reunion banners and tell the same moments in different words. A torpedo man from Heermann would say he could still feel the deck jump under his knees. A signalman from Callanan Bay would tell how his hands shook so hard he had to hold the flags against his chest to keep them still. A pilot would confess that for 1 second, lining up on the pagoda mast of a Japanese cruiser, he felt awe at the workmanship of the thing he was trying to kill. A survivor from Gambia Bay would simply close his eyes when someone asked about the time after 8:55. The numbers settle into their final comparative form because numbers, like ships, have weight. 1 center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, destroyers enough to throw a white bow wave across the horizon, stunned, fractured, turned back. 1 escort carrier task unit with 9 small escorts. 5 carriers still afloat at noon. Flights still cycling. A beachhead still breathing. 4 Japanese heavy cruisers, lost by day's end, a 5th maimed, others damaged, all in the shadow of a fleet that should have dominated any surface it could see. 3 American destroyers and a destroyer escort gone. 1 escort carrier, street. Lo, taken by an attack that would become a signature of the war's last act, a trade few planners would have accepted on a blackboard. A trade the men at Samar made, without asking permission. Return to the opening image. October 25th, 1944, 6:43. A wall on the horizon that looked like fate. Hours later, the wall is gone, replaced by smoke threads, oil slicks, and a scattered procession of ships moving east, not triumphant, yet undeniable. The foreshadow was true. An empire's last throw was in that first rolling thunder, but the throw did not land where it was aimed, not through overwhelming firepower, but through relentless interference. Not through perfect plans, but through resilient execution. Not through sinking the largest ship, but through making the largest choice too costly. A baby flat-top's wake glows in late light. A pilot dumps his fuel short of the deck and lines up for a landing on a surface the width of a street. On the radio, a controller's voice is dry as rope. "Come on home." And the sea, indifferent and complete, closes over the battlefield as if nothing had happened at all. One line remains, a button that deserves the silence after it. Against the center force, Taffy 3 did not win the day by killing. It won it by refusing to run out of time.